So in 2014, oh, turn it on, there we go. So in 2014, I was quite surprised to learn that something that I knew was a little app on my phone was acquired by Facebook for $19 billion. And what was even more surprising about that was that at the time, the company that produced WhatsApp had 55 employees, meaning that effectively the work output, the value of that output was essentially 345 million per person in that organization. In contrast, you've got the typical corporate scenario. Now, I'm not picking specifically on Aetna, but in the US, especially, for example, with health insurance, you're pretty much guaranteed to get 30 minutes of Muzak every single time that you call to do anything related to a claim. Let's say this is roughly the range that most large public corporations would operate at, around $800,000, $900,000 of value per employee. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, if you have a whole country that's essentially one big centrally planned system, if you scale up even more to that level, at the time roughly when the totalitarian system fell, the centrally planned economy fell in Poland, for example, the value generated per citizen was about $1,700 per person. So, given all of that, why is it that scaling Agile is such hard work? So, it's hard to execute when you're big. Now, one of the reasons that could be is that it's related to corporate culture, to the culture of the place where you're trying to do things. Why is that? Well, that's kind of related to how people are incentivized. I mean, a good definition of culture I came across recently is you look at why the last 5 or 10 people were promoted. That's pretty much your culture. And why is that? Well, a lot of those incentives tend to be tied to the way profit and loss is calculated within these big structures. Now, why is that? Well, those structures are the basis for which most of the decision making happens within the context of a big organization. So is it really only a question of size? So usually, the thing that comes up in this context is that when you scale up, you do get a certain economy of scale, a certain decrease of average cost as you increase output, up to a certain point. And then it starts costing you more and more to continue increasing output. So I want you to step back a little bit and think about any kind of a system, like think about a corporation as a way of organizing work, of executing tasks. And I'm going to do this in the context of new product development because it's quite close to where we are. So I think the output that actually comes out of this kind of a thing is based on the actual internal structure of that corporation. Just in the same way that the riverbed or the lake bed is going to structure how the water actually flows. Now, as organizations scale up, the same metaphor that's used for legacy code pretty much also applies. So, namely pickup sticks. So even though you know exactly how much the red bit, the green bit, the yellow bit, how much value that is, it's not very easy to actually pull it out from the pile of sticks because there's a whole bunch of other dependencies and things which are keeping you from doing that. So, it's hypothetically speaking, if you've done your customer development, you validated some kind of a vision for the company or for a certain product, and let's say you're absolutely spot on, then even though you have the advantages of pretty much, let's say, unlimited access to capital and capital markets. You can buy pretty much the best talent possible. You already have existing customers, unlike a startup, which is just starting out. You're still faced with this execution disadvantage of things, internal things, blocking you from moving ahead. And I think a lot of that's related to the fact that you can't learn because it just takes so long for you to release, the next. We can't do that because, well, the next release is in 2019. So the key concepts here that I think are quite important for the discussion to actually understand what's going on in terms of this internal structure are the embedded optionality of the structure of companies, process debt, and why firms exist in the first place. So let's start with optionality. So when you break one big thing into submodules, you can expect to get performance gains. If you break boundaries between things, it makes it easier to change it, to remove things, to add things, to port things. There's a whole bunch of different ways in which you can change systems when they're parts. And as a numerical rule of thumb, one of the things that Baldwin and Clark proposed is that if you have the same system, the system performance is going to go up by approximately the square root of the number of submodules of the same thing. Now, one place where this was first seen was when System 360 was being developed. Now, this is the first hardware-independent operating system. So we're talking these big room-sized computers. That's basically what they were delivering. And each time they wanted to slightly change the hardware, each time they wanted to slightly change things, their customers were really annoyed because it was really, really hard. So they realized they needed to break things into submodules. And as a complete side effect, after they did this for about 6 or 7 years, the whole system was going a lot faster. And the reason I'm going back this far into, let's say, our industry's history, is because I think this metaphor, this way of looking at the world of the software being really tied to the hardware, that's pretty much what we're looking at in terms of corporate structures. Now, once you do break things into submodules, there's a whole bunch of things which become possible. And in particular, you get a lot of options. Now, options are quite interesting. Now, what's interesting about them is that if you look at the optionality of having one thing or many small subparts, the value of an option on one big thing versus the value of having the same options on a whole bunch of small things, you can be sure that it's going to be that group of options on the submodules is going to be of greater value. Now, Robert Merton is a Nobel Prize economic winner who came up with this concept. Now, if you're increasing this optionality, if you're doing it, do it in such a way that each particular submodule is focused on one particular thing, and always make sure that it's completely independent so that you actually do have the possibility of extracting it from the system as a whole. And that's the way you increase the optionality as much as you can, increase the flexibility. Now, historically, and this has come up a lot already, historically, a lot of the difficulty in big organizations is caused by silos. And most of these were created simply because these were ways of increasing efficiency by grouping related things together. Grouping, for example, related functions together. But this leads to turf wars, miscommunication, different compensation between, let's say, sales and compliance. All kinds of things happen off the back of that. Now the thing is, if you have the whole organization as completely independent submodules, each submodule is going to be generating its own profit and loss, which then means that it pretty much behaves like an actual equity instrument, like the kind of thing you'd have on the stock market. So, and at that point, you actually can start bringing in proper financial option pricing to what it is that you're going to be doing with this corporate structure. And basically, the key message here is exactly how you draw those boundaries between those parts is what determines a lot of the other stuff and a lot of the dysfunctions that you see on the higher levels. Because it affects communication patterns, behavior, all kinds of other things. Now, a really important part of these boundaries is that when you do allocate costs, is whether or not. So basically, as a company scales up, what tends to happen is you have more and more things which are external to the components, and then are imposed on those components. The costs, the external costs, are assigned to those components themselves. So for example, something like buying a big server as a hosting environment for the whole company. How do you actually fairly allocate the costs of that across all of the units that are going to use it? Now usually, in cost accounting, they come up with all kinds of heuristics, but it's not necessarily based on how people actually use it. And this is where a lot of the disconnect starts to happen. Because then it means that each of the units are starting to calculate their profit and loss based on costs which are external to them, which are dictated to them effectively, which actually aren't related to what it is that they're doing. So in that context, the main tool to overcome a lot of this right now is process, especially on the boundaries between the various components. And process in and of itself is quite simple. So if I gave each of you a sheet of paper and asked you to describe to me how it is that you make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, I suspect we'd have as many different slight variations of the process of exactly how you do it. And all of them would result in exactly what it is that we want. But it means that, but because each of you actually know how to do this and you do this, and you do create your own sandwiches or make your own food, you know exactly what it is that needs to be done. So process debt is when you start creating processes that are externally imposed to overcome a lot of these issues between the boundaries of business units. And most importantly, it's these processes that cause all of the, I think in many cases, a lot of the clogging up of the system. And this is what actually makes it difficult to address customer needs and create value. And what ends up resulting in, because of all of this, is that you have increased wait time, it's very difficult to learn, you get overproduction in between components, and basically customers are more and more unhappy over time, sorry. Okay. And the last concept is why firms exist in the first place. So another Nobel Prize winner, Roald Coase. So this is going back even further, and he basically, if you think of why a firm actually exists, why companies exist in the first place, they were created to create this kind of bubble, this kind of alternate universe, where when you're inside this bubble, things work in a different way, and as a result, you can produce things in a much more effective way than you can outside on the market. And that particular model can be used to explain a lot of things, but one of the things it's really used for is scaling. So when you want to do something, does it make more sense to do it within the company or to go outside into the marketplace to see if you can have that done externally. And this, if it's done internal to the firm, if you keep adding tasks directly into what happens in the company, this is when you start getting your diseconomies of scale, because this is when you start having these costs which are applied to the business units externally, and this grows and grows and grows. So basically it means that the distortions in P&L across units just grows as the corporate structure grows. And then over time, this leads to resource allocation mistakes. So it makes it very difficult to actually execute. The other option is going out on the market. So if you do that, you've got search costs, you've got the actual cost of doing the transaction. Let's say you're buying enterprise software, so the actual lawyers to draft up the contracts, you've got the actual contract enforcement costs, and essentially it's always a question of a trade-off between doing something internally or externally. Now, if you make the right decision, that means you have extra resources which you can then reallocate as you see fit, so either into the business or extract it out and give it back to shareholders. And overall, this helps you speed up and do more with the resources that you do have. So how can you refactor corporations, refactor corporate structures? Here's three different approaches which you can take. So first of all, let's look at extracting submodules from something bigger. Communication. As complexity goes up, as there's more and more parts that need to communicate with each other, things become a lot more complex. The way to extract this is what you know, certainly what developers know from dealing with legacy systems. You look for something like a pinch point where there's a lot of things tied to that particular area, and in that particular point, you don't need to understand how it works on one side of the boundary or on the other. So this is pretty much the decision when you're doing this extraction. So you have a whole bunch of direct costs to what it is that you're doing, and on the other hand, there's a whole bunch of indirect costs. Here's just a couple of examples. So essentially what you want to do is take those indirect costs and internalize them so that they become direct costs as much as possible, so that each unit becomes self-sufficient. As a result, you start completely getting rid of indirect costs. So each unit's P&L is only based on the resources that it's actually using. And as a result, it makes it a lot easier to do a whole bunch of other things. So first of all, so you can minimize delays among parts of the system. Each particular module becomes more self-sufficient, effectively, and it makes it a lot easier to do things like planning and basically self-management. Looking at this from another angle, from the point of view of your customers, once you do have these things separated out more, if somebody does call you, somebody does call your company, how long does it take for them to actually find who it is that they need to speak to? How long does it take before their query is resolved? What percent of people actually get to the right part of your company to actually, so that they can actually get whatever it is that they need from you? And ideally, you're delaying the decision of exactly how you do something from what it is that you need to do. So this is kind of separating, just like in that hardware and the operating system metaphor. Even though you're doing things a certain way right now, try and separate to the extent that you can the one from the other. So just a quick example. So when I joined Line Data, it was actually I actually joined a small startup that was acquired by Line Data. Line Data is a producer of financial software. I work in hedge fund software, and one of the things that happened not long after I joined, they decided to reorganize the company structure around geographic units. So it made P&L reporting easier to public markets. Because, let's say, Europe was one unit. Unfortunately, what that meant is that when, for example, clients would interact with us, it meant that, so for example, an investment fund reaches out to us, they would be offered a whole bunch of things, a whole bunch of different types of software that weren't completely relevant to them, but were relevant from the point of view of geography. Because if they did in fact buy I don't know, leasing software for cars, hypothetically, it would help increase P&L in our European region. So basically they realized this is a problem after doing customer surveys, employee surveys, and they reorganized back around specific market segments and their needs, effectively around personas, and starting roughly around where that arrow was. And I mean, there are obviously a number of other things involved here, but I do think that actually that was kind of an important part of what was going on here. Next thing to look at is outsourcing, but not necessarily being certain that you're outsourcing, but look at what outsourcing could actually do in terms of company structure. So once you do reorganize to getting direct costs being applied, so you actually get a true view of what's going on, then you can take a look at what it makes sense to get rid of, whereas what it is that you might want to bring into the company from the outside. And this is going back to costs. So essentially, what you're doing is you're rationalizing. You're figuring out where on that spectrum for each particular thing that you do, you want to be from the point of view of your core business. And it's not necessarily black and white, because even though you do get this, you finally get this view of each thing being separate, and let's say some things, some divisions or some components you're making a lot of money on, some you're losing money on. There are a number of other factors. So, for example, current profits versus future profits. There's things like, for example, investing in early stage startup type, figuring out how something works, which you know is going to be unprofitable for a while. So in terms of product life cycle. So there are other factors involved here, but at least now you have a very clear picture of exactly what is going on within the structure of the company. And this is all about trade-offs. This is at this level. And in the same way that you have trade-offs when you're architecting a system like a software system. Just like you have, you're trading off reliability, security, performance, and a whole bunch of other things. These are also trade-offs, just in terms of where it is that you want to be. Just essentially, you're looking for the right combination so that the organization grows in a way that's scalable, and that you don't have these extra costs related to the increasing size of the organization. And I think it's worth pointing out that if you think you're making trade-offs, but it doesn't really feel that painful to some part of the organization, it's probably not a strategic trade-off. It's probably not one of those core things that you need to be looking at. Just a quick example of one type of arrangement like this. So for example, there's Accelerator Programs, which work with specific companies, such as Startup Bootcamp, who basically partner with a specific big company, and then the big company funds funds investing into startups in their industry, and then in this way, they can potentially participate in the upside of the startups. They participate, it's participate effectively in the R&D the startups are doing, and partnering, and possibly also becoming clients of the startups. So there's a whole bunch of layers in which this kind of makes sense, and actually each one of these programs comes from a specific partnership with a specific large corporate. And last but not least, inversion of control. So looking from the point of view of, again, the operating system I was talking about, just to describe this in relatively non-technical terms. So essentially there were different programs running on top of this operating system, and each of them would have to write a whole bunch of code, a whole bunch of process, a whole bunch of algorithms to do something like printing out, outputting something. And when they discovered that they can take all of that and pull it up out of those sub-programs and make it available as a shared resource, which they can use if they want to, everything became a lot more powerful. So essentially, going back to organizations, what you're doing here is you're pushing as much decision-making down to the people who are closest to what's going on, the ones who have the data as to making correct decisions. But in order to do that, the people who are in the front line do need to have some kind of a sense of what is value in the first place. So they need to have a good sense of what trade-offs, how they should be navigating the trade-offs. And this is usually the difficult bit. Cost of delays come up a couple of times. This is also basically coming from Reinertsen. You're trading off how quickly you get to market with a whole bunch of other things. Not necessarily at this kind of high level, but actually getting it down to specific dollar values so that you can actually do a trade-off between how much am I willing to accept for example, increase in expenses on a project if I want to get to the market a month earlier, and calculating it. Now, how this works from the point of view of delegation, a good example is actually the example that he gives with Boeing when they were working on the 777. So essentially, they realized that their technical design at the time would create a plane that was too heavy. But instead of having a centralized design board, or some kind of person to approve or reject specific designs as to how they're going to make the plane lighter, they basically agreed that they're willing to increase the cost of manufacturing a plane by $300 if that change would then reduce the weight of the plane by 1 pound. So for every pound reduction, the engineers knew exactly what they needed. They knew the financial limits of what they can actually propose. And as a result, they had 5,000 engineers working in parallel on figuring out how to make this plane lighter. So this is the same kind of approach that you have if you do manage to do this inversion of control using very clearly specified trade-offs. And a lot of this is about communication. So this is going back even further. So Pullman was a company still around today, I believe. They made train cars, and they had a problem where essentially there were 300 people working with brass, and there were 7, let's say, logistics people / managers running around amongst them. And because there were so few of the logistics people amongst them, a lot of the actual brass workers weren't working with brass as much as they could. They were actually doing some of the coordination work that effectively the managers should be doing. So what happened is that they chose to hire more of these coordinator manager people to reduce the task switching of the individual workers, and as a result, the overall profitability of the unit went up. So even though it seems counterintuitive that increasing the management layer actually ended up making it easier for them to be more profitable. So what does this look like from the point of view of corporate architectures, let's say, that exist today? So this is Handelsbanken. This is a Swedish bank. It's I think it's about 27 billion in terms of, so kind of, let's say, going on large cap at this point. 4 layers of the company. So down at the bottom, you've got individual, completely independent branch offices in various locations. Each one makes most of the decisions about its own P&L, and in terms of who to give loans to, what it is that they offer. There's some very loose coordination amongst them at the regional level here. Above that, there's certain central functions, so in this case talking about risk control and compliance, but there's other things like marketing or something like that. And the CEO. And that's it. Another example, I was actually talking with Dan North on the beach yesterday. So he, and I asked him about the example that he mentioned about Amazon offering HR via APIs. So actually it turned out that what Bezos sent an email roughly around 2004 to all of his employees that everything that they offer internally, all of their business functions, should be accessible via an API. And effectively, that every business unit is a microservice. Also, he specifically said that he, as the CEO, unilaterally reserves the right to expose this to the outside world. Every single one of these APIs. This is kind of what happened with AWS. Apparently they're doing something similar with call centers now. So now you have call centers that are actually Amazon call centers, but that are accessible via an API. And that can be used pretty much by any small business out there anywhere. So you can have software built around that and have a call center completely on call. Also, I think in that same email, he actually talks about the 2 pizza teams, which come up a lot. What a lot of people miss is that in addition to saying that teams need to be the size where you can actually feed the whole team with 2 pizzas, those teams need to be customer facing. And on top of that, focused on one thing at a time. So just to summarize, separate to the extent that you can what it is that you're doing and why you're doing from how you're doing it, and then think about whether or not the way the work is actually organized is keeping you from getting work done. And ideally, you want to get to the point where you do have the value of the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. And I do have a small ebook if somebody wants to grab it at that URL. And that's it.